Okay, so let's dive in here and break this down in a way that feels a bit more conversational. So, under a potential second Trump administration, we'd be looking at some substantial shifts in the U.S. government's legal stances, especially in cases before the Supreme Court. Yeah, that's right, Trump's return would likely mean a different approach to a few high-stakes cases, some of which have really sparked public interest. One of the most significant of these is the Tennessee case concerning gender-affirming medical care for transgender minors. Now, why is this important? You see, each presidential administration often has its own views on hot-button issues, which affects how they handle cases at the highest levels of our legal system. For instance, under Biden, the administration has argued that laws banning medical care for transgender minors like Tennessee's law are discriminatory. But with Trump back in office, we might see his administration shift away from supporting arguments like these. According to some legal experts, this wouldn't be out of the ordinary, as similar shifts happened during previous transitions of power, like in 2016 and 2020. Kamerinsky, a prominent legal scholar, points out that these kinds of changes are, a pretty typical response when one administration hands over power to another with different ideals. Okay, let's get into what these potential changes might actually look like. Trump recently suggested that he'd nominate Matt Gaetz as Attorney General, but interestingly, he hasn't yet chosen a candidate for the Solicitor General role. This position is super important because the Solicitor General argues cases before the Supreme Court on behalf of the government. So whoever ends up in this role would have a lot of influence over which cases they prioritize and how they argue them. I mean, really, think about it, this one role can affect some of the biggest issues of our time. Now, on top of that, Trump's return could affect cases beyond just the transgender youth issue. For example, legal battles over ghost guns are also in the mix. These are firearms that are largely untraceable since people can build them using parts or kits they buy online. This topic has been quite controversial, especially with gun rights advocates on one side and gun control supporters on the other. Under Biden, the administration supported a regulation aimed at these ghost guns, arguing they needed stricter oversight. But if Trump's back in charge, we might see a move to pull back on those regulations. This is because, traditionally, Republican administrations like those we've seen with Trump tend to favor less regulation. Okay, another issue to keep an eye on is nuclear waste storage. Under Biden, the administration supported the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's authority in licensing these storage facilities, but again, this stance might be reversed with Trump back in office. Michael Dorf, a professor of law, pointed out that the Trump administration would probably adopt a less regulatory stance here, which would make a lot of sense given its approach in the past. This goes back to how political ideologies influence decisions. It's like, each administration has its own priorities, and those priorities often align with either increasing or decreasing federal regulations. What's fascinating is how these shifts fit with the broader picture of the Supreme Court itself. We've got a 6-3 conservative majority on the court right now, with 3 of those justices appointed by Trump himself. Yeah, this is huge because it means the court's majority might already lean towards some of the legal positions that a Trump administration would support. So, when people like law professor Steve Schwinn say the court wouldn't mind seeing Trump's Solicitor General pushing certain stances, that kind of makes sense, right? The majority on the court might even welcome these positions. Okay, now let's think about another area this could impact securities fraud cases. Under Biden, the administration sided with shareholders in cases involving big corporations like Nvidia and Meta, supporting the right of individuals to pursue fraud claims against these companies. But with Trump back in office, we could see a pivot that's friendlier toward corporate interests. This is actually consistent with how other Republican administrations have approached similar cases in the past, emphasizing a less restrictive regulatory environment. But this isn't the first time we'd be seeing shifts like this due to a change in administration. Yeah, it's happened before. And honestly, it's a natural part of the democratic process. Deborah Whitus, a law professor, talks about how these changes are just a reflection of differing political views being expressed through legal stances. It's like the administrations are bringing their unique political lenses into how they approach the law. Back in 2017, when Trump first took office, his administration reversed Obama-era positions on several issues at the Supreme Court. For instance, they took new stances on labor unions, election laws, and even transgender student rights. One of the big moves Trump made back then was to scrap a directive that let transgender students use bathrooms that matched their gender identity. And as a result, the Supreme Court ended up dismissing a case that had centered around a transgender student's right to bathroom access. Then Biden came in and reversed some of Trump's actions, particularly on immigration. Under Biden, the administration withdrew Trump's appeals defending his strict asylum policy and his plan to reroute military funds for the border wall. So, yeah, if Trump returns, we'd probably see similar rollbacks on Biden's initiatives. It's like a pendulum swinging back and forth, depending on who's in office. Now, the Tennessee case about gender-affirming care for minors is still a question mark. It's hard to say exactly how the Supreme Court would respond if Trump's administration tried to change its stance on this one. But the Justice Department isn't the only party in this case. There's also a group of transgender teens and their families who are challenging Tennessee's law. So even if Trump's team backs out, the case might still proceed. Let's talk a bit more about the ghost guns issue, since that one's getting a lot of attention too. The Supreme Court recently heard arguments on a Biden administration regulation targeting ghost gun parts. During these arguments, most justices seemed open to the idea of upholding the regulation. But if Trump's back and decides he wants to rescind the rule or drop the appeal, that could totally shake things up, assuming the court hasn't already issued a ruling. So, yeah, that's the landscape we're looking at. We'd probably see shifts that align more closely with the conservative-leaning court, especially on issues like regulatory oversight and transgender rights. And this isn't unusual in American politics. The legal positions of the government at the Supreme Court can vary drastically based on the ideology of the sitting president. Each administration has its unique priorities and its own view on what's best for the country. So, in summary, if Trump were to return to office, we're looking at a set of major legal stance shifts across several cases. His administration might align more closely with the Supreme Court's conservative majority, which could mean changes in the legal landscape that reflect less regulation, especially concerning hot topics like gun rights, nuclear waste storage, corporate accountability, and the rights of transgender minors. And yeah, in a democracy, these kinds of changes are bound to happen whenever a new administration takes office with a different set of values. It's part of how our system reflects the people in power and their views. Short. If Trump returns to office, we can expect a shift in the U.S. government's stance on several high-profile Supreme Court cases, particularly those on transgender rights, gun control, nuclear waste storage, and corporate regulation. Under Biden, the administration has backed laws protecting transgender minors and regulations on ghost guns and flavored vapes. However, a Trump administration would likely reverse these stances, aligning more closely with the Supreme Court's conservative majority. Legal experts predict this shift reflects each administration's unique political perspective, a common occurrence when transitioning between Democratic and Republican leadership in the U.S.